You probably hear the 4% rule a lot, but what does it really mean to withdraw 4% out of your taxable investment portfolio during your early retirement? And I'm going to break it down for you. And keep in mind that it's only from the taxable brokerage account. I'm not going to include 401k, Roth IRA, or other retirement accounts in this video. Only the taxable brokerage account. And so, what if you retire early with $2.5 million only in your taxable investments? That sounds like a good problem to have, right? To make things simple, I'm just going to say that all of your 2.5 million is in one single index fund and you've held your investments for at least a year. So inside your taxable investments, you're going to have what's called a cost basis and unrealized gains. The cost basis is what you contributed to this index fund for however long you contributed. If you use my retirement calculator, if you save, let's say $30,000 a year for 27 years with an 8% average annual return, you're going to have about 2.5 million. And out of that 2.5 million, you're going to have about $800,000 in cost basis, or what you contributed in after-tax dollars over the years. And 1.7 million is what you'll have in unrealized gains. For you math nerds out there, I know these are not the exact numbers, but I rounded it down to keep things simple. So don't come at me in the comment section, okay? And I love you guys anyway, but we'll just use that as an example throughout this video. You don't get taxed on the cost basis because you made after-tax contributions, right? The government is not going to tax you twice. So you're only going to be taxed the unrealized gains at $1.7 million. So if you decide to sell all 1.7 million in unrealized gains, you're going to be taxed for 1.7 million out of that 2.5 million. Or let's say if you decide to sell the entire 2.5 million, you're only going to be taxed for the 1.7. You're not going to be taxed for the $800,000. So let's just say the whole thing was held in less than a year. You would be taxed up to 37% in federal income tax. But realistically speaking, depending on how long you've had this index fund in your taxable brokerage account, you could have a mix of both short-term and long-term holdings. So the long-term holdings will be the shares you bought at least 1 year ago. If you sell them, then you'll be taxed at 0, 15, or 20%, and the additional net income tax at 3.8% if your modified adjusted gross income is at least $200,000 for single individuals or $250,000 as a married couple. So let's break down the capital gains tax rate. This is going to be based on the year 2024. If you sell your entire investment of $2.5 million with 1.7 million in capital gains as a single individual and assume that you have no other income, your standard deduction in 2024 is $14,600, which is non-taxable. Then your taxable income is going to be $1.685 million. This is assuming that you have no W-2 income or any other income sources to make this scenario as simple as possible. And I'm also going to assume that you've had this index fund for at least a year. So your first $47,000 of your capital gains is taxed at 0%. Then your next $471,000 of your capital gains will be taxed at 15% because the dollars between $47,000 and $519,000 is under the 15% capital gains tax bracket. Then the remaining $1.16 million will be taxed at 20% capital gains tax rate. It is still far below the 37% marginal tax rate for the federal income tax, right? And because you're single and over the $200,000 income threshold for the net investment income tax, there's going to be an additional 3.8% tax for anything above $200,000. If you're married and filing your taxes jointly, then the net investment income tax threshold is anything over $250,000. If you're filing married and filing separately, then it's going to be $125,000. And if you're a head of household, then it's $200,000, anything above that. Okay. So it's obviously not ideal to cash out the entire 2.5 million because then you will have to pay the marginal tax rate at 23.8% if you include the net investment income tax. Your effective tax rate in this scenario will be about 21%. It is still far cheaper than paying the federal income tax for up to 37% in the marginal tax rate, right? But what early retirees want to take advantage of is the 0% here and the 15% right here in capital gains tax brackets when they don't have any W-2 income or other income sources. Again, this is assuming that you are retired or you're in the early retirement stage. So with a 4% withdrawal rate, that's going to be $100,000 out of that 2.5 million in investments. After the standard deduction, your taxable income is going to be 85,400. So the first 47,000 is still going to be taxed at 0%, but the remaining $38,000 is only taxed at 15%, or about $5,700. Then your marginal tax rate is going to be 15%, but your effective tax rate is significantly lower at 6.7%. That is still better than paying 22% in federal income tax, right? If you only want to live on interest, then you owe capital gains tax on the entire $100,000 that you sell. Just don't forget about the standard deduction for the year, or if you decide to itemize your deductions that exceed the standard deduction, then you could increase more tax savings. There's also a strategy to lower your taxes by selling some of your index fund from the cost basis and some of that in interest. What that means is that you don't have to sell all $100,000 in interest. Maybe you could have $10,000 in cost basis and have the capital gains at $90,000, then you only get taxed on $90,000, right? You can schedule your one-on-one session with me by visiting firechair.com/consultation. By the way, I am so fired up to announce the launch of my private FIRE community for people just like you and me who are passionate about investing, saving, and achieving financial independence and exploring different possibilities to retire early. My private community will allow you to connect with me on the platform and get in touch with other like-minded individuals or couples who are just as serious as you are with the FIRE movement. As a member of my private community, you'll get resources like investing, saving, paying off debt, or finding the right place to grow your money. For a very limited time, please enjoy the free trial by clicking the link in the description below. But if you're married, let's say, and you're filing your taxes jointly, your income threshold to 0% capital gains tax rate is much higher because you get to double your standard deduction, and that's $29,200 for the year 2024. So using the same scenario by selling $100,000 in capital gains with no other income sources, then your taxable income is now reduced to $70,800. And because the capital gains tax brackets for married couples are much higher, from $0 to $94,000, your entire $70,800 in capital gains is taxed at 0%. And at the time I'm recording this video in 2024, the 0% tax threshold is $94,050. So if you add their standard deduction by $29,200, then you can actually have up to $123,950 in total capital gains, and you still don't owe any taxes. You could pay yourself up to $61,625 tax-free as a single individual. Again, this is assuming that you have no other income sources and you're only living on your taxable brokerage account with an index fund or other types of investments. And you don't have to imagine living on $100,000 a year tax-free. It is reality. And I just showed you how this works. If you need to fact check me, just go to the IRS website and check the capital gains tax threshold if you want to, okay? Now, I'm gonna be a little more technical here and let me know if you enjoy this type of content. Let me show you an example of the cost basis summary inside your portfolio. This is just an example and it doesn't belong in anyone's portfolio. But anyway, if you have any positions that you've been holding for less than a year, it's gonna stay short term or something like that on the left side. And you don't wanna sell this specific position in your index fund, because if you bought it less than a year ago, then you're gonna be paying the federal income tax up to 37%. So if you're looking to pay yourself more without paying, let's say 15% on long-term capital gains, you should look at the lots that you've had for at least a year. Your broker should be very specific and state that it's a long-term position, because selling a long-term position would trigger a long-term capital gains tax rate at 0, 15, or 20%. That makes sense so far, right? And just let me know in the comment section down below if you want me to make a separate video about the differences between first in, first out, last in, first out, and other data structures. I can get into those technicals. I don't want to bore you with those terms in this video for today. But anyway, if you were to sell a position from this tax law from April 22nd, 2022 in the amount of $1,600, you would owe a capital gains of about $1,000 that has gained over the years. So if your capital gains tax rate is 15% based on your current income, then you would owe $150 on taxes. And let's just say that you want to minimize your capital gains, then you can always look for the one that has the smallest gains. And this one, for instance, at the bottom here, it has the smallest long-term capital gains at $570. So I could sell this by just paying $570 and find another tax law that has the second smallest gain. And when you take a look at your index fund, there's going to be a link to show your tax lots, and that's for each time you bought into the index fund. Okay, so I could sell index funds that I bought most recently with the least amount of unrealized gains, or another tax lot with the most principal or cost basis. And this is just an example, and again, it doesn't belong to anybody's portfolio. So using a 4% withdrawal rate, out of that $100,000 I sell, if 10% of that is in principal, then I owe taxes on the $90,000 in interest and earnings. This is a good strategy if you're looking to withdraw something like, let's say $150,000 as a married couple, and you're trying to minimize your 15% capital gains tax. And that could save you potentially about, $4,000 in taxes if you do it correctly. And here's another scenario where you can live off that $2.5 million tax free. And let's just say that you don't want to sell out your investments at all, and you want to just live on qualified dividends from an index fund, okay? You still only get taxed at 0, 15, or 20%. For example, if $1 million of your portfolio is in a high dividend yield index with a 3.5% annual dividend yield, then that's $35,000 you'll get paid every year from the index fund. And keep in mind that this is an early retirement scenario. I don't really invest in high dividend index funds right now during the accumulation phase because I'm still working, right? I would rather not pay 15% in dividend tax every year for my tax brokerage account while I am still working. And so during the accumulation phase, I want my portfolio to grow and not pay me dividends. When I retire early, I could use some dividends to pay for my expenses without any other income. That makes sense so far, right? And keep in mind that you need to make sure they are qualified dividends. You could be paying federal income tax if you receive non-qualified ordinary dividends. And I did a detailed video on that on my channel if you want to check it out. Any non-qualified or ordinary dividends could be taxed up to 37%, just like the federal income tax. I think it's pretty simple to decide whether you want to pay up to 37% in federal income tax or up to 20% in capital gains tax, right? It is extremely important to keep track of your expenses now, even during the accumulation phase, okay? Are you going to have your mortgage paid off by the time you retire early? Because paying off your mortgage is going to lower your FIRE number by a lot. You might not even need all of that $2.5 million invested to retire early, because the only thing you have to pay is your homeowner's insurance and property tax every year, depending on where you live. And I plan to have my mortgage paid off by the time I retire early. And I help my clients, my private clients that is, keep track of their essential expenses like food, transportation, utilities, and insurance so that they know how much they really need to retire early. Inflation is one thing we all need to keep track of. Not every item on your budget is going to increase by 2% annually. Some items may go through deflation when the prices drop, or higher inflation when the prices go up much higher. You have to calculate your FIRE number at least once a year. And I do that every year in January to look back on my budget from the previous year. You should also keep track of your total annual expenses. Do you need your car repaired every year? Do you have enough cash set aside or for your medical and dental expenses. How often do you plan to travel every year? Personally, I would be able to travel at least 4 times a year, so I want to include that in my FIRE number as well. Could I retire with $100,000 a year, tax-free, and travel 4 times a year without a mortgage payment? I know I could, because I keep track of my stuff, my expenses. You have to do the same. And the most important thing is the cash allocation when it comes to emergency fund. And no, it's not the typical 3 to 6 months of expenses. Depending on the age at which you retire early, you might need 18 to 24 months of expenses set aside in your emergency fund in case of a stock market crash or a long-term bear market due to a recession. It really depends on your FIRE number and your early retirement age. When you go through a bear market, like in 2022, you probably don't want to make any withdrawals from your investments, right? This is where cash can come in to help pay for your retirement expenses. And then when the market goes back up, then you can replenish that emergency fund by selling your investments. And you don't have to follow the 4% withdrawal rule. Some people can live off of 3% or less. You don't even need $2.5 million, okay? If you look at a Trinity study, the 4% withdrawal rate was much more successful with a portfolio of 100% stocks. You're less likely to succeed if your portfolio is 50% stocks and 50% bonds with a 4% withdrawal rate. And I encourage you to read that study whenever you get a chance. Not every item on your budget is going to increase in price every year. And I mean, no matter what inflation does in the future years, I would still rather have 2.5 million than nothing at all in my early retirement. And if you're afraid of the market crashing, that's what the cash reserve is for. I don't plan to touch my investments when we go through a bear market, and I just use cash to pay my expenses until the money goes back up. You should also consider joining my private FIRE community. To connect with me by visiting firestrategy.com/community, or just schedule a session with me by visiting firestrategy.com/consultation. And this has been another beast of a video, and I hope you got a lot out of it.